Good morning, WTOB listeners. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law. I'm Dylan Greenwood.
And I'm Harold Eustache.
It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning, as always. We just finished up a two-part series on DWIs, and we're still going to keep it in the realm of traffic. In fact, I would say that this is probably the way most people come into contact with our criminal justice system, wouldn't you, Harold?
You generally, people, almost everybody that's an adult has a license. And, as everybody knows, driving is a privilege in North Carolina. So we're going to talk today about ways in which that privilege can be suspended or revoked and taken away and how to get it back.
Right, because no one drives perfect all the time. And someone is inevitably going to get a ticket. And even just one ticket mishandled can lead possibly to a suspension of a license and
That's right.
maybe even a revocation, just depending upon what it is and the severity of the ticket. The most common way in which we see this happen is people forget about it.
Right.
Yeah, they forget about court, they forget about paying their fine, and then all of a sudden it starts a whole avalanche, really, of stuff that can potentially happen to them.
Yeah, I mean, when I first became an ADA in Rockingham County, I ran traffic court, and that was my first sort of time seeing this kind of snowball effect where a person would get a speeding ticket, forget to pay the fine, or something would happen, and then not know their license is suspended or revoked, and then get driving while license revoked on top of that. So they've got the unpaid fine, and then plus another charge of driving while license revoked, and that can just start a cycle that makes it difficult for any driver.
Extremely difficult, and the impact that can have can go far beyond just the license itself. And you think about how, especially in the state of North Carolina, there's not a city or a town that I know of that's set up with a built-in infrastructure for mass transit. And so when you think about it from that perspective, a car, or the ability to get around with a car, is a very dear privilege for a lot of people.
Right.
And that privilege, like you said, can be taken away, and it's taken away through suspensions, and it's taken away through revocations, and there is a difference.
Yeah, there is. And suspensions in North Carolina are when you have a valid license, and then there's a term of time in which your privilege is suspended. It doesn't mean your license is completely gone. It just means there's some specific amount of time, and that amount of time can vary depending on what the circumstances are. But once that time is over, if there's been no other sort of violation, technically you're eligible to have your license back again.
Right. And once that term is over with, you don't really need to do anything else.
Right.
It's just the term of suspension is over, and all of a sudden now you get to drive again and not worry about some sort of extra violation of the law should you get caught.
Right.
A revocation is a little bit different in that it literally revokes your driving privilege. It's entirely removed from you. Basically, your license at that point is canceled. So that's why it's really important to distinguish or find out, based off of whatever you're charged with and whatever the penalties are you facing a suspension, no suspension, or a revocation? Because it can make a big difference, because if your license is revoked, to get it back, all of a sudden you got to do stuff.
Yeah, you got to reapply.
Yeah.
For a license.
In some cases, you got to retake the test.
Right. That's right.
It could seriously depend. And one thing that we tell people all the time, Harold, and I know you have a ton, and I even know, even watching you in court as a DA, is something I always respected you for, that you made sure that people didn't get taken advantage of by the system. And I thought that was so important, because one of the biggest ways people get taken advantage of by the system is just paying tickets off.
Right.
They think that just by handing the money over to the court system that that's going to make it better or that's going to make the ticket go away. That is not the case.
Right. I mean, a lot of times people aren't understanding that, if you, let's say you get a speeding ticket, let's say and it's a ticket that's 80 miles per hour and over, that could have ramifications for suspension. That could be a moving violation. That could put points on your license that you don't know how many points you're accumulating, which can have all sorts of ramifications. I mean, it's really, really important, even though it seems like something minor like a speeding ticket or, a stop sign sort of thing. But those kind of violations, it's important to have a lawyer even for those because they really, really can impact your ability to drive in North Carolina.
Right.
And there's a bunch of different reasons that your license can be suspended. So do you know what some of those are?
Yeah, absolutely. Just rattling a few off the top of my head. Obviously, failure to pay fines. That's number one. Failing to appear for your traffic case. That's 1A, 1B, whatever you want to call it, between that and paying fines. And what's interesting in North Carolina about traffic court is that every county generally is set up for an administrative traffic court and a traffic court where someone has to go in front of a judge because those are typically more serious cases. And regardless of whether it is an administrative court session or a session in front of a judge, failing to appear for court can have the same impact on your license regardless. Now, one or the other might impact other things involving a bond or something else a little bit differently, but that's a discussion for another time. But other things that could suspend your license, speeding violations and reckless driving. If you're convicted of certain speeding violations and reckless driving, you absolutely can have your license suspended. Failing to stop following an accident is one, and offering to give aid. That can lead to a 1-year suspension. And then street racing is one. Illegal street racing, if that's a conviction, that can be up to a 3-year suspension. And then something that everybody worries about with a ticket, or the common question is, how many points? What are the points? And how does that work?
And so in North Carolina, there's this it's not necessarily convoluted, but there's a rubric that basically lists every different Chapter 20 offense. And Chapter 20 is the code of the statute, North Carolina General Statute, that traffic offenses are under. And it lists all these different offenses and corresponding points for each offense. So, and as you can imagine, based on the severity of the offense, there's more points for it, and the least, offenses that are less severe get less points. And then after you can accumulate these different points over a period of time, and if you get 12 points, your license could be suspended at that point.
And generally the DMV will contact you when you get around 8 or more and offer you the ability to take a driver safety course in an effort to reduce some of the points down. That is something that if you get contacted, you definitely need to take advantage of it, because it's really easy to get 3 and 4 point driving offenses that all of a sudden you get 1 or 2 tickets and the DMV is suspending your license. And if it's on the first suspension for a points violation, it's 60 days. On a second suspension, it's 6 months. And then on a third suspension, if you keep the ball rolling, it's a 12-month suspension. So, that could be a significant chunk of time that your license is taken away.
And an important thing to remember on these suspensions is, I know earlier we said, well, if your license is suspended, let's say for 30 days, then you don't have to do anything, it goes right back. Well, one of the ways that your license can be revoked is if you get a moving violation while your license is suspended.
Correct.
So, you can go from suspended to revoked pretty quickly if you get another violation there.
Right. And so that's why when people get speeding tickets or some other traffic violation, usually it's an attorney's goal to get it to that non-moving violation. Common non-moving violations would be improper equipment. You've probably heard of that before. Failure to notify DMV of address change. Actually, seatbelt violations are non-moving. So, there's a number of different non-moving violations that some tickets can be pled to. Specifically, as it involves a speeding ticket, a non-moving violation for improper equipment has a cutoff.
That's important to know.
And it's a very it's a huge demarcation line that at 24 miles per hour and less, you're eligible for an improper equipment. That's not necessarily just a court thing. That's a DMV thing.
Right.
And so, some people, they go to court, let's say they have a really high ticket, it's more than 24 miles an hour over the speed limit, and the court gives them an improper equipment. So the person leaves and they go, oh man, I got that non-moving violation. DMV will actually kick that back and then suspend your license and not honor the non-moving violation, basically. Right. But while we're on the topic of suspensions and points and everything else, it's also really important, I'll touch on it briefly, to take into account insurance points.
Yeah.
So when you get a traffic violation that could eventually lead to a suspension, you also need to worry about your insurance going up, and just a 3-point offense, which is one of the more common ones, at minimum can lead to a 65% increase in your insurance for a 3-year period. If you get 2 of those tickets, so all of a sudden, let's say you're at 6 insurance points, then you're looking at a 150% increase in your insurance for that amount of time. And if you're getting on up there to 12, where you could possibly get your license suspended due to that amount of points accumulating on your license, you're looking at a 400% increase in your insurance over the course of 3 years. So that is very, very significant. So as you can see, as we talked about before, the ramifications of stuff involving your license, possible suspensions, possible revocations, they add up, they snowball for somebody to where it affects your job, it affects your insurance, it affects your ability to get around.
Absolutely.
I mean, it can get out of control.
WTOB listeners, if you're just joining us, this is For the Record with Greenwood Law. I'm Harold Eustache along with Dylan Greenwood. And so far this morning, we've been talking about licenses and suspensions. Another important aspect of this is revocations. And one of the most common ways a license can be revoked is a impaired driving conviction, so a DWI. So, the important thing to remember is generally after a DWI, first DWI, a person's license is revoked for 1 year. A second offense can result in a 4-year revocation, and a third offense can result in a permanent revocation. So after that DWI period, let's say a person has one offense where they're convicted, they would have to, reapply for their license. And it's also important to remember that for DWIs, there is another Chapter 20 offense that's a Class 1 misdemeanor. If the person is driving on that revoked license that's pursuant to the DWI, it's called a driving while license revoked with an impaired revocation, pursuant to an impaired revocation, meaning that your license is revoked for the impairment.
In a lot of jurisdictions, they treat that almost like a second DWI.
They do.
And they take it real serious.
It can, again, it's a Class 1 misdemeanor, which can carry up to 120 days in custody. It is taken very seriously by prosecutors all over the state. So it is definitely not something to play around with. And even what can happen is, a person can go that 1 year where their license, they know they have that revocation period, and they don't get an assessment. And that assessment doesn't go to DMV. This is something that we see a lot. And if that assessment is not properly handled by DMV or the assessing agency, then that person's license will stay in a place of impaired revocation for a decade or more.
Yeah, in fact, DMV not only wants to see that you've done the assessment, a substance abuse assessment, but they want to see that you followed the recommendations of the substance abuse assessment.
Right.
And that's what we see people all the time. You know, they call us up and they're like, well, it's been a year. I went to try to go get my license. What gives? And we go, well, you didn't do what you're supposed to do. And if you would just do those things, it's going to clear it up.
Yep.
And you're going to be all right.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, it's just a matter of doing it. And that's one of the ways that you can get this revocation off of your license, so that then you can pay. And it's a special fee that you have to pay for a DWI. It's a little bit extra beyond the normal reinstatement fee. It's a DWI specific revocation fee that you have to pay for to get your license back in good standing. The other thing with DWI is it isn't just DWI convictions that can revoke your license. Getting a DWI charge will revoke your license for 30 days just for the fact that you were charged. And so that's something that people run into all the time, and they're kind of left bewildered on the other end of a charge of a DWI, and all of a sudden, they're trying to figure out what to do, and then on top of it, they don't have a license.
Right. And a lot of people are ask us about this, and we kind of touched on it, I think, in one of our videos earlier. But when you're charged with the DWI, it's an implied consent offense. Mm-hmm. So the state of North Carolina gives you what's called a civil revocation for a period of time, which can be generally 30 days. And so your license would be revoked during that period of a civil revocation. It's important to remember during that time that period of revocation can also result in the the Class 1 misdemeanor of driving while license revoked for an impaired revocation.
Absolutely.
In that 30 days, even though you haven't been convicted of a DWI yet. Now, again, with all these suspensions and revocations, are there ways that people that have suspended licenses or revoked licenses can actually drive?
Absolutely. And one of the most common ways is something called a limited driving privilege. So that is most commonly used as it relates to DWIs when your license is revoked pursuant to a DWI. And they're actually two different types. So, we mentioned that there's two different types of DWI revocations. One for pretrial, that's that 30-day revocation. And honestly, that's a revocation. Yes, it's a minimum of 30 days, but if you don't pay the money to the court to get your license back, then it just kind of hangs out there a little bit until you pay the money to court to get your license back. And then there's a post-conviction revocation that happens. That's a different type of privilege. The pretrial privilege you become eligible for after 10 days from the date of offense of the alleged DWI. The post-conviction DWI driving privilege, sometimes you're eligible for it, or a person is eligible for it immediately upon conviction. Some people have to wait depending upon the level of which they were alleged to have blown or the blood test results show. So if it's higher than a 0.15, your blood alcohol content is higher than a 0.15, then all of a sudden you have to wait 45 days to get a driving privilege. And in that 45 days, you also have to get a portable intox machine put on your car so that you can crank it up. But to even be eligible for those types of driving privileges, you can't have had a prior DWI. Mm-hmm. You have to have a valid license at the time. So you have to
have insurance.
You make sure that your license isn't suspended, it isn't revoked, it's in good standing, all that stuff. And it can make all the difference in the world of having some semblance of normalcy in the midst of a stressful process.
It's important to remember if you have a suspended license or a revoked license for a DWI for civil revocation or a conviction, it is important to have counsel, because these are not getting these limited privileges is not something you generally want to do pro se on your own. You're going to want to have counsel to present this to the court in the right way and make sure it gets done correctly.
And the reason why they're called limited is that they're for specific purposes. Your driving privilege isn't being fully restored, it's being restored on a limited basis so that you can go to work, so that you can take your kids to school, so that you can grab food and take care of your home and yourself it's literally like the bare bones stuff. Usually when people talk to me about it, I say, listen, you can't drive for fun.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to think about it. If you're driving and you're having a good time, that's not what you need to be doing if you're on a limited driving privilege.
And if you are driving outside of that privilege, you could, again, get the driving while license revoked for impaired revocation, even with the limited privilege. So you would have to drive within the parameters of the limited privilege.
Now, Harold, this year there was a brand new driving privilege that was passed in the law. It's very exciting, and basically it allowed for a driving privilege when you had a suspension due to a failure to comply with court costs or fines. This just came into effect.
Right.
That has to be purely the only reason. It's the fines and the court costs. And basically what it is that you can get a limited driving privilege. It lasts for a year. You cannot have received a limited driving privilege under the statute within the last 3 years. So you could technically get one every year. The purpose of this type of privilege really is to allow you to get out, get to work, be productive, save the money, and pay off those court costs, or hire an attorney to maybe consolidate some of those court costs, because that can happen too for people, depending upon what everybody's circumstances is. There's definitely some wiggle room when people's license are trying to be restored.
Oh yeah, and this is something we see all the time. I mean, a lot of people, they get, like we talked about earlier, you've got to go to work, got to go to school, got to get your kids to school and all that. And if your license is suspended and you get caught, I mean, it becomes that snowball. So this is a good way that if you are trying to get your license back, seek an attorney out to figure out how to get this limited privilege. It'll help you out.
Absolutely. Limited driving privileges aren't the only way, however, to get back out on the road. Another way is by hiring counsel. A lot of times what an attorney can do is take a look at your whole driving record in its totality, figure out exactly what's going on. Maybe it's a lot of failure to appears. Maybe it's old tickets that you didn't even know that were out there, or maybe it's failure to pay some fines. And when you fail to pay a fine, it can not quite, but it can almost double the fine associated with the ticket, depending upon whether you failed to miss court, whether you failed to comply within a certain amount of time. It just, like I said, it can really snowball. And what an attorney can do is take all that and a lot of times work something out where it's consolidated. It could save money. It can make it so that maybe you do have some tickets on your record, but maybe they are all of a sudden they're non-moving violations instead of a bunch of moving violations that get you points. I mean, there's any number of possibilities that can happen there, and it really just, I would argue, it takes a deft touch.
Yeah, it definitely does.
And to really just know how all of these Chapter 20 traffic violations interact with each other.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, yeah, no doubt. But Harold, using a driving privilege and using an attorney, that's not the only way that you can potentially get back out on the road, is it?
No, it's not. There's another avenue, and that's which is used sometimes, which is a DMV hearing. Sometimes, if you've been convicted, especially for DWIs, but there are other reasons that your license could be revoked. The DMV will require a hearing, and those hearings are done by a hearing officer at the DMV. They're generally done actually at the DMV in the office. They are recorded. They're administrative hearings, so they are recorded, and they can have judicial review in Superior Court, but generally they stay with the DMV, and those DMV officers have a lot
of power.
Well, yes, they have a lot of power to be able to make a decision about the future of your license. So if you are in a position where you need a DMV hearing, again, you are able to have counsel at that hearing. You are able to have witnesses and other things. So it's important to have counsel at those hearings.
Yeah, and one of the things that they typically want to know is they look at your prior driving history. They look at whether or not you've still been driving with a suspended or revoked license. That typically is not taken well.
Nope.
But you're exactly right. That amount of power that they have literally comes down to being in the hearing, that person making a split-second decision, doing a few strokes on the keyboard, and all of a sudden you have your license back and available. And there are multiple types of DMV hearings, all of which do have some filing fee associated with them, and they vary depending upon the type of hearing it is. There are non-DWI specific DMV hearings, and then there are DWI specific hearings. The thing about DWI DMV hearings, that's a lot of letters, but the thing about those is that they're typically divided into two parts, and you'll actually pay a fee for both parts. So the state kind of gets you there on the fees and everything associated with it, but there's a lot of different ways in which your license can be restored and can be put back in its proper place, and then depending upon how bad it is, it might cost you some money, but I think you're going to end up better off in the long run.
Yeah. WTOB listeners, don't forget to join us next week on For the Record with Greenwood Law. We're going to be talking about 50Bs and all the consequences that can come out of those 50Bs, which are essentially restraining orders. And there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of things that I think people don't know that can happen with a 50B that are very, very important. So please tune in next time.
And before we go, please do not forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights. And that's first and foremost, I will not represent myself in a court of law. Second, I will not do law enforcement's job for them. 3, I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. 4, I will not consent to searches when asked by law enforcement. And 5, I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. Remember, everyone, it's not a crime to know your rights and to assert those rights. There's a lot of different options out there for a lot of stuff. In general, I think the law and a lot of people in the criminal justice system want to get people back on the road, unless there's just a absolute concern for safety. So there are a lot of options for you out there, especially if your license is in trouble. But remember to stay informed, stay safe. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law, signing off.